Good morning. Today is Wednesday, August 14th, 2024. This is the Arlington County Board of Equalization hearing. We have 6 members present and a 7th member attending virtually, so we do have a quorum. 5 cases on the agenda. The first case is RPC 35008020 at 701 12th Street South. And Mr. Balzotti, you can start with your 8 minutes to tell us about the trial.
Thank you. Good morning. As I said, I'm Vincent Balzotti. I'm representing Wilkes Artis on behalf of these cases this morning. Our first case is 601-701 South 12th Street. It's about a 582,000 square foot office complex located in the former Pentagon City. The building was formerly leased almost entirely by TSA and is now almost entirely vacant. We have 3 main points of contention in this case. First is the potential rental income assumed by the assessment is not reflective of market rents as of the date of value. The second is the operating expenses assumed by the assessment are also not reflective of market expenses, as we will show through comparable properties. And the third is the capitalization rate, which everyone loves, assumed by the assessment is not reflective of market as existed as of the date of value based on sales and other data, which we'll go through. For the first point, market rent. With regard to market rent, as our exhibit in our appeal, I think it's page 3 of our appeal and page 112 out of 142 of the county's package shows the average asking rent in this area as of the date of value was only $37.45 per square foot before concessions are considered. As has been discussed, I believe, in previous cases, several years ago, in sort of an attempt to lessen the dramatic shifts in value related to deductions for concessions in the year they're realized, the county began to allow for deduction to in-place rents for concessions. This had the impact of smoothing out the concessions over the term of the lease and created more stabilized values from year to year rather than seeing big swings, in the years in which these large concessions were being realized. For tax year 2023, the county allowed a 10% deduction. In the county's guidelines for 2024, it states, and I quote, concessions are considered on a case-by-case basis, end quote. It's also generally accepted appraisal practice to consider concessions when deriving value, and yet the concessions, based on the market rent here, were not considered in this case. Further, it seems that the $38 per square foot rent assumed by the county, assumed by the assessment, is based on a prior lease, the old TSA lease, which is many years old and several years removed from actually being in occupancy. So we believe that has no relevance to the market rent as of 2024. To a second point, operating expenses. The actual expenses of this property for the last 4 years aren't real expenses. Obviously COVID happened in 2020. The buildings were mostly vacant or mostly unoccupied or unused for a couple of years, and the tenant moved out. So the last couple of years has been vacant. We prepared a study of stabilized office buildings in the county, and this is all cases, all properties that were, considered stabilized or would be considered stabilized by the assessment. And we found the average expense rate was $11 per square foot. In a case such as this, where there is no history of operating expenses to draw from, the use of a comparable set of properties is an appropriate method to derive what an acceptable expense rate would be for a property. There is no history here. We can go back many years when TSA occupied the building, but those expenses are going to be impacted by the fact that it was a TSA lease. It's a quasi-government agency, 100% leased. All those things impact the expense rate. So going forward, we're not assuming this building is going to be leased by one entity. It's going to be multi-tenant and likely. Therefore, the expenses are going to change. So the comp set we have has all those things. They're more recent data. There are multiple properties that have multiple leases in there, and they're stabilized buildings over the last few years. So we feel an $11 expense rate is somewhat is reasonable given those comps. The county guidelines even state, quote, the expense rate is developed by reviewing the actual reported expenses for the property in prior years and expenses of comparable properties. So again, in this case, given the lack of recent history, we believe the comparable property set is what we need to look at to ascertain what a proper appropriate expense rate would be for this property. And to our final point, the capitalization rate. As you've heard over and over again from us and I know other appellants, we believe the county simply missed the mark with regards to their derivation of cap rates this year. As the first 40 something pages of our board book goes through all the research that we have done and all the data that we have out there that shows that. We believe the county relied heavily, if not entirely, on one sale of an extremely high credit tenant in a sale where the buyer has been shown to have paid a premium for that building. We also believe there's wide market data to show that the cap rates the county used are wrong. Further, we believe there's sales-driven data to support a much higher cap rate than what the county has adopted. At 1776 Wilson Boulevard sold at a 7.4% cap rate, which, if you look at the Corpax report, indicates that would have been an 8% cap rate as of 1/1/2024, which in assessment terms is actually a 9.08 cap rate when you throw on the tax rate there. That building was built in 2012, and the county guidelines rate for that age group calls for a cap rate of about 7.13%, almost 200 basis points lower than that sale indicated. The only real other sale in the last few years, like the Corpax used in that report, is the Microsoft building, which, as we talked about, as you've heard, is purchased at a premium, very high quality tenant. That's not comparable to this property. 100% leased or 99.1% vacant building here. It has been since TSA moved out. Also, as just stated, this property is 99.1% vacant. It is assigned the same cap rate that would be used to value a building that was 100% leased as of similar age, as the assessment gives no consideration whatsoever for the additional risk associated with a property with huge vacancy. Other neighboring jurisdictions, such as Fairfax County, allow for an adjustment to the cap rate to reflect this risk. If the building is 100% vacant or even significantly vacant, it's a sizable amount of risk to a property owner to the income stream. You have no income coming in. There has to be a difference. It has to be some sort of consideration given for this added risk. And I know a lot has been made about the uniformity and how it respects the cap rate. And I just want to point out that the cap rate is the only variable used in determining assessments that does not vary and is not impacted at all by property-specific data. Rental rates, reimbursement income, vacancy rates, operating expenses, tax rate loads, and deductions for lease-up all are property-specific. Yet the cap rate, which is clearly seen in sales, as the Corpax shows, all those cap rates are different. So sales clearly show that the market considers cap rates to fluctuate based on property-specific data, and one of those data points is vacancy. So to assume that a property that is 100% leased by GSA for 20 years and a property is 100% vacant would have the same cap rate is simply not realistic, and it's not shown in the market. And I believe the data that we presented and shown in our board book shows that. So with that, we respectfully request that the assessment be reduced to a value of $20,892,800. Happy to field any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Peralta for the county, please.
Thank you. Just a little background for this property. Since 2020, this property has seen a $189 million decrease over the years to today. The 2024 assessment represents a 32% decrease in assessment from last year. That's a 25.7 million deduction from last year's assessment. To say that the county isn't providing any sort of concessions to the effect that this property's current condition has is I'm sorry, the assessment does show that there's a decrease in the assessment. When you look at the overall market in that general area, the market asking rent is $39.27. We're currently assessing this property at 38,000 square feet. Guideline average for the county is in this general submarket is $40.50. You'll see that I included the CoStar report on page 12 of the packet, and you'll see the breakdown of the submarket and what is viewed as the market asking rents and guideline. You have our guideline average. CoStar estimates the rent for this property at $37 to $45 per square feet. And we know the current condition is vacant. We've, accounted for this year over year. The building hasn't changed materially over the years. If there's an upside to this property, we do see, and we noted that in last year's BOE hearing, that Avis rental car agency is in the garage in both buildings. We do see that we underestimated the parking in the original assessment. We had parking at 200,000. We do see that they're reporting 800,000 in parking for 2023, but the actual gross, if you want to reference the rent roll on page 106 of 108, we do see that the gross parking income is rented at $5,754,605, and there's some type of concessions that maybe Mr. Balzotti can speak to that. But then the gross for the year should have been, both buildings combined, $1.226,000 even, and that's a breakdown of building 601 at 656,000, and then building 701 570,000. Again, I do see some type of concession given, but the gross overall is $5,754,605, and I'd just like to remind the board we're at 200,000. I do remember at the time of inspection that the property manager had mentioned that due to the communications contract in the building, they're unable to do the renovations that we know that they're supposed to do. There's actually renderings of it in CoStar of what is supposed to happen. I think in the meantime, with this rental to this rental car agency, I think that is the one upside. I mean, the building alone hasn't changed, but the income we know should increase over the life of the term of this this car rental agency. So with that, we're open for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Question from board members? Mr. Manskin.
For the appellant, was TSA in the building at all during 2023?
I believe TSA moved out at the end of 2022.
The end of 2022. So the answer is they weren't there at all. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misspoke. I believe they moved out at the end of 2021 is when I believe they moved out, and they occupied the building in Springfield at that point in time.
Okay, great. And for the department, you mentioned, excuse me, the appellant mentioned that there seemed to be no accommodation for the concessions that they feel that they're going to, significant concessions in a mostly overwhelmingly vacant building that they're going to have to provide to attract somebody. And you had talked about some other kinds of elements of your I&E analysis that kind of, favors the appellant, but you didn't get to directly to the concept. And I guess the department position on including concessions in highly vacant buildings in your analysis. Is that a policy you go look at other things, or what is your position on concessions?
Well, I thought I spoke to it, but let me speak more specifically. The guideline average for that market area is $40.50. I would say that the $38 is inclusive of the concessions that Mr. Balzotti is speaking of. And we've seen not all tenants receive concessions. They may get a lower per square foot rate. They may have, there's different parameters or variables that are included with this rate, this one rate that we're using. In addition to the $38 a square foot, we're deducting 28% of that due to our vacancy and collections figure of 28%. So the actual net rent is $27.36 if you were to deduct 28% from that. So we're already at a discount. We're not only that, we're uh, allocating 80 million in concessions below the line. So
Yeah, for the year. Yeah, okay, good stuff. Follow-up quick question. One of you, I think it was the appellant, mentioned what asking price is in CoStar for this vacant space. Whoever noted that, would you repeat it, please?
yeah, the market asking rent is 39.27 on average. The range is $37 to $45 per square feet.
In CoStar, depending on the suite and the floor and all that. Thanks a lot.
Any other questions? No? Okay, Mr. Peralta, if you take a minute to wrap up.
Yes, thank you. What I didn't speak about is the expenses. There is a history of the property, and we've used that history over the years. As you know, the property was fully leased at one point at $8.50, and we know that once this property is renovated and improved upon, that it'll be more efficient at the time when the lease when it gets fully leased and stabilized. Again, overall 189 million since 2020, 30%, 32% decrease in the 2024 assessment, and it equates to about $25.7 million for this year alone. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Belzadi, if you take a minute to wrap up, sir.
Absolutely, thank you. To some of our points, the market rent chosen by the assessment, we've shown does not rely on relevant data. It relies on an old lease that was from many years ago that's since been expired and they moved out. We believe the asking rent in CoStar is less than what the county has said it was. We had that in our case as well, and we believe that this fails to consider concessions. When they said that they consider concessions with the deduction that they given, there's no concessions in there. It's lost rent, TIs, and leasing commissions. Concessions are not in there. So they failed to include it above the line. They failed to include it below the line. And almost all tenants in this market get concessions. This is a tenant's market. This is not a landlord's market. Everyone's getting concessions, mostly. Again, cap rate. There's no consideration for the high vacancy. High vacancy drives cap rates higher. It's been shown by sales. It's been shown by the market. We believe that there needs to be some sort of consideration for the cap rate here, given this is 100%, almost 100% vacant building. It'll take a long time to lease it up. Anyone buying this building is not going to assume it's the same cap rate as a 100% leased GSA building. It's simply not realistic in this market. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you both. All right, it's just among the board. Mr. Metzgen.
But the wrap-up comments by the appellant were telling on the concessions. Sure, there's write-offs and lease-up expenses, and that's standard and appropriate. But they've been vacant for an entire year plus. And there's a couple of ways to do it, either lower. So the county targeted the vacant rent, the potential rent, just about in the middle of the range. Makes sense, except that's not working. By definition, nobody's taking a lease. And so I'd like to either lower the rent by $1, the asking rent, the vacant potential rent by $1 a square foot, for instance. Or I was thinking of this before, but now I've abandoned it, or I find it less compelling, increasing the cap rate for this year. I don't think, and the reason I'm downgrading that is because 1 year's worth of no leasing to me isn't a trend significant enough and exceptional enough to fool with the cap rate. So I'd rather go for the rents, lowering the rents, because clearly the asking's too high, let alone the getting, which doesn't exist. Finally, I was looking at the expenses. We've heard over and over again from this appellant's representative that $11 is the average. I don't know how they divine that, but yesterday we had a similar, it was 40%, and the county went from last year's $8 a square foot. Did I say last week? I mean, yesterday, did I say that? From $8 to $8.75, accommodating for the fact that the per square foot OpEx ought to go up, assuming a more highly tenanted building. Here too, this is $8.50. Maybe it should go up 25 cents. I don't know. It just seems to be cleaner. So that's my third option, but it seems to me it would be cleaner to lower the anticipated rent.
Mr. Yates?
One concerning the rent and concessions. County's starting at a $40 rent and they're lowering it. And typically they would give concessions 10%.
10%, yeah.
Well,
And here it's not.
10%, not $1.
Well, they were at
$4.
38 here.
38 is not off of $44.
Yeah, right. It's, oh, okay. So my dollar should be $2 to make it 10%. Fair enough. Good stuff. All right. Is that what you're saying?
Yes,
Yeah. Good.
that's one of the notes I had. The other, I was okay with the expenses. They went through on their tests. They went on the original they were the 850. One thing that we have done before, where we're giving them 1 year in the lease up, we have gone ahead and given 2 years on an empty building.
On an empty building.
We have done that. I don't know how it feels about that.
Or let's say half the space for 2
Yeah,
years.
You have 500,000 square foot plus building,
Yeah.
empty.
It's a fourth alternative. That's worthy.
Mr. Hoffman?
I mean, I think Rob's gone down quite a bit from last year when it was already known vacant. And if I'm getting the math right, it's $95 a square foot for almost 5 acres in prime location. We shouldn't really be looking at this as much as cap rate. Like, I think the business plan is probably going to be a little bit different from, let's try to lease this building up to a bunch of little tenants. So you start looking at it more like, what's the ground worth? What's the frame of the office building worth? What's the parking garage worth? Almost like a clean slate versus an income producing property. So, I mean, I would say, the longer this thing sits vacant, the more you start to look at the Amazon land sale next door and maybe comp it to that. I haven't done that. I was trying to run some numbers on it. I think it's probably significantly higher than, $50 or $60 an FAR foot. It's kind of in that range where we're at right now. So, I mean, I'm fine with 55 million. I think that's a pretty low value, to be honest.
Greg, you said it was $55 a square foot for the land only.
No, I was trying to pull out those old numbers, but I don't want to really get into that speculation right now.
Okay,
but it might be, the longer this thing sits vacant, it might be more of a exercise in what's the ground worth or what's the shell of the building worth, because it's not going to be like you could take a 3 or 4 year vacant TSA single tenant building and all of a sudden multi-tenant it without spending a ton of money. Like, I agree with that. But I also think that having large sites available in Arlington with single owner control, that's like a very rare thing, right? So you get a big user coming along and all of a sudden it's a home run.
Okay.
Greg-
Mr. Lawson?
Greg, is when you say the big site, is that both buildings or just this one?
There's 2 buildings in this economic unit.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I've got
it'd
it. The total is 4.88 acres, something like that.
So you'd raise
For the
both
2
buildings.
RPCs. So, I mean, Barnes at a 4 FAR, it's 900,000 square feet. That's $65 a square foot. And I think that there's probably properties next door that are way more than a 4.
Oh, sure.
It could be, that's a reasonably attainable density for that site.
Okay. Other folks? Mr. Yates?
No,
Okay, if you don't have anything,
No,
Mr. Panorama?
I'm okay with the original assessment, and even if you lower by $1, the rent.
Well, it's 2. I support his 2. Go ahead.
If you look at the reconstruction, I mean, the parking income itself is already adjusted by almost $600,000. By the way, I think the county is using the lower range of the forestry rental rates. So, I'm okay with it. I don't think and it's a big reduction last year's assessment. I think at 55 million.
Well, it's a big reduction, because it deserves a big reduction, you know.
Consideration of the line numbers, I think it's huge.
A couple of year vacant building is, and if you're talking about trying to find a single tenant, this building is gonna be sitting there a while. And the valid, if you're talking FAR, then that has some costs to go with it to put up something different. But this building is trouble.
Yeah,
Long term.
I'll share my thinking. Yeah, what I did, I think Rob did a good job on the test. And so I've got about 5 calculations here. What I did is I said, okay, let's assume the cap rate should be raised. I ended up at 53,227,500. So it's a reduction of about 2 million. I think the problem with what Greg is suggesting is the only project I'm aware of right now that's going forward is one by Orr Brothers, and they were able to reuse the garage. So they tore the building down, left the garage. Here, we don't know if this is one shared garage or 2 separate garages. I just don't know. And I think there'd have to be an analysis if this is ready for a raise and rebuild. And I think you're right, Mark, that this is going to sit here for at least, I mean, on my own property, we're looking at a rezoning from office to residential. And I met with my land use guy yesterday, and he said, well, I'd say between 18 months and 3 years. So
to get the approval.
Yeah, to get the change. So I think there should be a slight reduction, and I'll see what the consensus is.
Based on what did you get to? What did you reduce?
Oh, I based it on taking what Rob did on the test.
Yeah.
And applying a cap rate of 9.19, and then deducting.
100 basis points higher.
Yeah.
That's what it comes out to.
So I'm down by, what is it? A little more than 2 million.
We do that, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I was fine with the rent. I don't think lowering $1 or $2, it's kind of, like you said, getting in the weeds. I did kind of run a test. Because I know yesterday we made an exception for a property that was
Right.
less vacant than this. So I split the cap rate between the appellants. Actually, may have used the wrong number, but I came up with like a 8.85 or so cap rate, and it reduced it by 10 million, but that didn't seem right to me. So I'm okay with the exception as well. So I just the county's original or conservative reduction.
Yeah.
Yeah, the original one, I think I'm okay with 50.
See, when I did my test 8.475, and I ended up with that.
Okay.
All right, well,
But I used that
I believe,
instead.
Mr. Hoffman, you're
Yeah,
with the original?
I'm okay with the original.
I think we got
I think
consensus
that-
for that.
Fair enough.
Would somebody like to make a motion?
Sure. I'll move that we confirm the county's assessment at 55,566,800.
Recommend.
Okay, motion and second. All right, Mr. Penaranda, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay, it is 4-3, and that's without Mr. Matskin, Mr. Lawson, Mr. Yates. The county is confirmed at 55,566,800. Thank you. Okay. Everybody stays the same for the entire morning here. So next case is RPC 16012040 on North Kent Street. Mr. Balzadi, you can start with your 8 minutes on this property.
Just to confirm, is this the 1777 North Kent Street?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I just had the wrong parcel written down in my notes. Thank you very much. This is 1777 North Kent Street, also known as Rosalind Plaza North. It's a 277,000 square foot office building located at the northeast corner of the Rosalind Plaza complex. 4 main points here to discuss. One, the reimbursement income assumed by the assessment, we believe is not reflective of what is actually going to be able to be achieved at this property going forward. Two, again, the operating expenses we believe assumed by the assessment do not reflect a stabilized property. Three, the capitalization rate we believe is not reflective of market as it existed as of 1/1. And further, we believe the deductions that were allowed for the costs to stabilize the building are not reflective of what's actually going to be required. To the first point, the reimbursement income. Corporate Executive Board previously leased about 39% of the total NLA of this building, and about half of the leased area was CEB. They have vacated. They haven't occupied the space in many, many years. They had subleased some of it, but I think they hadn't occupied any of the space on their own since even before the pandemic. Despite that, their portion of reimbursement income was significant. They're half of the leased space. Going forward, this reimbursement income will not be received, even if that space had been released as of 1/1. Given what base years would have been set in 2024, there'd be no reimbursement income on this space in 2024. So we believe in this case using the actual reimbursement income from the prior year is not appropriate because it's not happening going forward. It's not going to be received by someone who would purchase this property. So anyone buying the property wouldn't assume that reimbursement income and wouldn't capitalize it going forward. So we believe we have to consider that that they're half the leased space. That portion of reimbursement income will not be received going forward. Second point, operating expenses. As we've stated before, the prior 3 or 4 years of operating expenses here, we do not believe are reflective of what a stabilized property would be. Since COVID, things have been a little bit, sort of wonky in terms of, use and stuff like that. So anything after COVID is probably not realistic, especially given that CEB wasn't in their space, sublet some of their space and then vacated their space. We believe it's more, impactful to look at comparable properties. Again, we have the expense study that shows comparable properties such as this have around $11 per square foot in expenses. Again, these range. They range from the low end of the low 8s to high end. I think one of the expenses was $17 a square foot. In that study, we also removed the outliers. There are a bunch of properties that are at $6 a square foot, a bunch of properties that are even higher than $17 a square foot, but there are special situations. So we removed those to try to get to a number that is based on properties that are multi-tenanted, are stabilized, and are indicative of what an expense rate should be. I think the county's expense rate in the guidelines is even below $8 per square foot, and that I believe is an average of all properties that they received INEs for. We tried to drill it down on just properties that are stabilized, just properties that have full service leases, things that would be comparable to the subject property. And we believe that $11 per square foot is a reasonable number, given this competitive set. The capitalization rate, I know we've talked about this ad nauseum, but I won't go through our argument for the base capitalization rate to change too much, other than to say again that we feel the county relied upon that one sale. We feel that there's sales out there, 1776 North Wilson Boulevard. We feel that that sale shows the county missed the rate by about 200 basis points. Again, our first 40-something pages of our board book go through our details of our research and the market data and the sales data and the Corpex report and things like that that we believe demonstrate that the cap rate is just wrong to begin with. Additionally, this property was roughly 60% vacant as of the date of value. With regard to the cap rate, there's no consideration given. I know there's considerations given in terms of deductions. The county gives deductions for lease-up costs. That is correct. However, that is not cap rate. A potential purchase of this property would do both things. They would assume the cost they're going to have to spend to lease the building up. At the same time, they would also assume a higher cap rate because of the risk. The two things go hand in hand. Assuming additional expenses doesn't mean you've mitigated the risk to your income stream, because it's speculative. You're speculating I'm going to be able to lease this building up. Well, in the short term, the risk to your income stream is very, very high if the building is 60% vacant. This has been the whole world has changed since COVID. Office buildings are not what they used to be. There are buildings selling for pennies on the dollar. There's a building in Arlington County that's assessed at $59 million right now that's going to sell for $20 to $25 million soon. Buildings in DC are selling at a fraction of what they sold for a few years ago. And I know that these buildings have been reduced over time, and this is true. However, just because the property has been reduced doesn't mean that the assessment's correct. It doesn't mean it's been reduced enough. And the main place that we believe hasn't been given enough consideration by the assessment is the cap rate. The cap rate's one of the biggest drivers of value, and it's one of the biggest points that has moved drastically over the last 3 or 4 years. The Fed rate jumped up over 230 basis points. That has a significant impact on cap rate. It has a significant impact on everything. That's why everyone's mortgages are now 6 and 7%. I refinanced my mortgage at 2.65 when COVID happened. That would be 350 basis points higher now. And part of that is because of the Fed rate changing, which impacts all rates across the board, especially cap rates. And we feel that the assessment, again, is not given appropriate consideration for that. And finally, the costs associated with leasing up the building. Each year, the assessment provides a 1-year lease-up period. Absorption in the county has been negative for the past 3 years. If every building leased up in 1 year, absorption would be positive and vacancy would be declining in the county, not increasing. So this idea that every building that will lease up in 1 year is not shown in the market, because you would see that. You'd see the occupancy rising in the county, you'd see vacancy declining, you'd see absorption increasing, and that's not happening. Again, tenants are contracting their spaces because they don't use as much space as they used to pre-COVID because people don't go in the office. This is a reality. It's happening in the market, and you're seeing it with absorption. You're seeing it with leasing. So to assume a 1-year lost rent each and every year is not realistic. Additionally, the TI allowance of $90 per square foot, we don't believe is appropriate, given that other properties, such as the property that we just talked about, that have significant vacancy issues, in which the spaces are going to have to be demolished and rebuilt when new tenants come in, is going to be higher than $90 per square foot. The counties use $115 per square foot on other buildings. Similar situations like this, where you have a large block of space that's been vacated by a single user, and that's going to need to be completely gutted and brought back to a shell condition probably, and then hopefully find a tenant to lease it. So the costs associated with that have gone up dramatically because of both demand is not there, and the cost of capital and the cost of construction has increased dramatically also. So we feel that that's a place where the assessment has sort of missed the mark also. That's all I have. With that, we respectfully request that the assessment be reduced to a value of $37,887,000. Happy to handle any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Carlton for the county, please.
Yes, thank you. Again, for this property, the 2024 assessment represents a 20% decrease from last year's assessment. That's a $16.3 million decrease. As you see, the property is somewhat stabilized over the years. The original assessment did account for that CEB lease to expire. As you see, that we actually overestimated the vacancy by 3,984 square feet compared to what was reported in the 2023 INE. They're at 56,025 square feet vacant on the rent roll. We did take in consideration what the appellant had stated as CEB leases expiring. And what Mr. Balzati didn't speak to is our per square foot rate. Our per square foot rate for the original assessment is at $42. After the rent roll analysis of the 2023 income, we did see that the average for leases in place is at $54.57. That's almost a 30% deduction from what is leased in place. Upon retesting, we did increase. And so for the sake of argument, we did use the appellant's numbers just to, keep everything's apples to apples, but we could have easily gone in excess of that if there's any question about this reimbursement income. You see that the overlying number for net operating income for 2023 far exceeds far exceeds what the previous years have been shown. We're at almost a $2.7 million difference lower than what was previously reported from 2020, and more than that in the more recent years. So if this property were to trade, the the income or the net operating income, which would be used to derive the cap rate, would be closer to what they reporting in column E. Due to our guidelines, where the sales lack in the county, we do make adjustments, and you'll see the profound difference with our adjustments when you compare columns E to E1. So, right then and there, it's almost a $2 million difference that, we afford based on, our lack of sales, our range, that we exceed the range that our CORPAC study has shown. And in addition to that, we provide an additional, I guess, concessions, if you will, or adjustments before capitalization to kind of adjust to where the sales lack in the county. So, that comparison alone should show you that, we don't take an a la carte approach to, valuing these properties. It's interesting to see that the appellant has picked and choose what they want to keep. The market as a whole, we believe, was at 22% vacant. We're using they're using the 28% vacant, but then adjusting the cap rate, to where they think that the cap rate for this property at 41% occupied should be higher than a property we just saw that was 100% vacant. So to me, that doesn't really, make sense in the scheme of things. They keep speaking to this study they did for expenses as well at $11 a square feet. I believe it's only a handful of properties. The county's approach is looking at the county as a whole. I believe that they only included about 10 properties in their analysis, that they included in this packet. We've looked at this actual history of this property, and they've been averaging $8 a square feet. There was a bump for this year. But then again, we smooth it out as we do with other properties. So the original at $8.50 in the original assessment, and then we're testing higher at $9 a square foot, and we still come up to a higher value than what we originally had. And the county is just reverting back to the original assessment, and we're asking to confirm this case. But given every point that I made just now, I think it's reasonable to assume that the original assessment is supported. We're open for questions, so thank you.
Thank you both. Questions from board members? Mr. Mendez.
Sure, for the county, the appellant touched on this in their argument, but in the last case, which was of course 90+% vacant, $115 was used for TI, and in this case, only $90 is used. At what point does the county feel it's appropriate to use that $115 per square foot number for the below the line?
Yeah, in our guidelines, we say that if the property is receiving anything $45 or higher, then we would assess or actually use $115 a square foot. This property, we have effective age of 1990, which is higher than what was previously, I believe, in the other property. So we believe, and that property, I believe, had since it had the one single-use tenant, and with the GSA, I believe that was in there, they didn't renovate any of that space there. So 115 was appropriate for that property versus this property.
Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Metzger.
This is for the department. I want to talk about pass-throughs for a moment. We know that about 30%, 22% of the building went vacant at the end of 2023 in time. So meaning the corporate executive board. Did you take that into account when you did the test, knowing that that block was now empty?
No, I did not, and this is the reason why. When the county in the past had, I guess, grossed up or projected the pass-through income, it was always a point of contention whether this new lease would have any pass-throughs, or the first year you wouldn't see any pass-throughs for the new tenants. And we were projecting based on the term and X, Y, and Z, but to take that argument off the table, we've always used what was actual. And even when all these new tenancies on the reverse side, all the new tenancies would kind of speak to a higher projected pass-through income, or a higher taxes, or whatever increase would have been reasonable given the new tenancy. So we've always used actual income, and I think you'll see every case that comes before the board that's the case. Are there circumstances? Yes, but my counter to that again would be our per square foot rate is much lower than what should have been on the property.
All right, yeah.
Other questions? No? Okay, Mr. Peralta, if you take a minute to wrap up.
Yes, thank you. Again, for this property, I'd like to restate that the average rent for leases in place is $54.57. The original assessment, which the county is asking the board to confirm, is at $42 a square foot. We're using exact numbers in our retest, as the appellant has stated. They're using a higher cap rate for this property, which is 41% occupied, versus a lower cap rate that was used in a property that's 100% vacant. So I think perhaps their cap rate analysis should be reviewed with respect to different properties in Arlington. But overall, again, this property received a 20% decrease from last year, equating to a $16.3 million decrease. So we asked the board to confirm this case. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Falsati, if you take a minute to wrap up, sir.
Absolutely, thank you. With regards to the difference in cap rate between this property and the last property, as I believe Rob mentioned, that property had been renovated more than this property. Therefore, it's more risk to the income stream. The cap rate should not be necessarily directly comparable every single time. Rob had mentioned something, Mr. Peralta had mentioned something about if this property were to sell, the cap rate would be based on the 2023 NOI. That's not correct. No one buying this property is assuming the 2023 NOI. That NOI doesn't exist anymore. CEB is gone. The property is 60% vacant. You can't look at past income to predict what's going to happen in the future, because the property doesn't exist as it did in 2023 anymore. Regarding our expense study, we didn't use 10 properties. We used 24 properties. We used every single property in the county that had full service leases and was actually stabilized. The fact that there was only 24 is telling at how bad the market is and how high vacancy is in the county. You can't find that many office buildings that are stabilized and have been stabilized above 70% occupancy the last few years. So we used everything that you could to derive the operating expense number. And regarding the TIs, the other building being more renovated.
I'm sorry.
Versus this,
I got to
thank you very
interrupt.
much. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you. All right, it's just among the board. Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, so yesterday I had a meeting with a group of lawyers that want to lease our vacant space in our building. We had tried to lease as an office for about 9 months, and we realized that was fruitless. So we signed a contract to get it rezoned to residential, and that's just begun that process. But what the lawyers told me is they are subtenants at the office building. I think it's right over there. And they're paying like, I don't know, $20 a square foot. And so they were talking to me about temporarily coming in at about that rental rate. And so there are a number of tenants out there that aren't even dealing with landlords. They're just going to tenants that have vacant space and subleasing. And so what I did, in order to be fair to the county, is I took the test column and I upped the cap rate by 0.5. I ended up at 65,285,979, which is, a modest reduction from what Rob did. I think that, I mean, we've been hearing every single applicant, whether it's this one or someone else. But I mean, the fact is the county's cap rates are not realistic. So with that, I'll see if anyone agrees.
I'm sorry, the final value you came up with?
65,285. Well, I would have to round that up to 286,000 even.
And that's because it's a 60 or more % vacant.
Yeah, the vacancy and I kind of didn't want to get into nitpicking Rob's figure, so I just used his test and then up the cap rate by 0.5.
But it's based on high vacancy.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because of the
you're making-
vacancy.
You're
Yeah.
making an exception because it's such high vacancy, as we did yesterday.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Yates?
One thing I get by that Rob said is that what he did is his rental rate. Compared to what, he had built a lot of, accidentally, it seems, but built a lot of things into that price. And that brought it down, and I think that made the big difference. And that offsets the expenses a little bit. 60% is a lot of space in this market. And that's where I'm still going to, at certain points, we have to consider what it's going to take to lease these spaces up, and it's not a year.
Yeah, that was one of mine. Well, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
You,
No, the only thing I was looking at, and I should have asked them during the questions, is the leasable area that the county used. It's almost 2,000 square feet higher than what the county is using and what the Chesto is also using. So the only thing I did is an adjustment of that square footage. I reduced it from the original assessment, using the same 28% vacancy just based on the leased space and the vacant space. Then below the line deductions, it drops some, but it's not as far as the losses. Drops down to 66,298,800.
So say, how do you feel about, we have a lot of buildings that are over 50% vacant. Across the board, being able to put 1 year below. That's where I'm starting to think that maybe it is a 2-year figure.
The thing is that, we've always said, the assessments are done on a yearly basis, but since the years ago used to say, you can lease that any time. We don't know.
Or if it's not leased, guess what? Next year we'll have another year's lease up cost below the line.
Right.
And the year after that.
And I think they're still going to be coming back like that year after
Yeah.
year.
Fair enough. And they'll get it year after year. I mean, I think
We've done it.
the
We've done it.
department just does that
It's
right.
usually been over 50%. But
Yeah, we've done it in very, very rare. I mean, I was leaning towards it in the last case because it was 95% leased, but still every year they get their 1 year write-off. I don't see what's wrong.
Okay. Okay.
Or deduction,
Mr.
not.
Hoffman?
I was okay with Barnes's number. I think just a small adjustment to the cap rate there makes sense.
Let me add the effective year, and it's in the write-up in our packet. The effective year is not correct. It really ought to be 10 basis points lower, the cap rate. The effective year clearly should not be 1990, but in the late 1990s. And there's, again, a 10%. So that kind of offsets the appellant's argument for lower than what the department has come up with. Mark made one note, and I'm making a second, namely the rents. I'm making a second in support of what the county has come up with.
Tremendous.
Yeah, funny enough, I got a number very close to the also number. The only thing I did was just looking back at the expenses. I know it seems that there's a lot probably baked into the income number in column D, but I just bumped the expenses to $9 and I came up with 65,288,000. So I support Mr. Lawson's number.
Wait a minute, the expenses were $9. That I missed something. I'm so
Yeah, it
sorry.
was $850 initially in column D, and then I just bumped it up to $9 and got us.
Oh, you kept column D and
Yeah.
changed. Oh,
That's probably more justifiable than my theory.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would go with that one.
Wait,
I
so
would
what,
too.
It's 65,288,000.
That was just
Just
the
one.
original assessment.
Yeah, that fooling with the cap rate. If you're hell bent to lower it, that's a better case.
You know, in fairness, they, you know, the summary that they did on the other cases where I printed. I mean, there's a lot of buildings where the expenses are higher than, like I see one for 812, but most of them are above 10.
That's this appellant's representative chronic
Yeah, yeah.
point of view. That should be
All
11.
right, I'm gonna,
I think there's a lot baked into those, to that income number there, because it's
Right.
significantly lower than.
That's what I was.
Buildings,
Yes, Mr. Yates made that point earlier.
very low vacancy.
okay, Mr. Mendez.
Sure, yes, I vote that we move the value of the 2024 assessed value to 65,288,000.
Second.
Second,
Motion is second by Mr. Lewis. All in favor? Aye, opposed? Okay, that's unanimous. Assessments reduced to 65,288,100 based on the original assessment, increasing the expenses $9 a square foot. Okay, next case is RPC 34027-567, 3550 South Park Street. Mr. Belfatti, you can start your 8 minutes on this property.
Thank you very much. 3550 South Clark Street. This is a building, built within the last 10 or 15 years. With four main points of contention here. We believe the rental rate assumed by the assessment again fails to consider concessions that have been granted at the property and will be granted by any lease that's happened at this property probably in the next 5 to 10 years. Second, the operating expenses again we believe are not reflective of a comparable set, which we will show. The cap rate again, we believe the county's missed the mark on the cap rate. And last, the deductions they have given for the lease up, we believe are too low and need to be higher. Concessions. There are 2 office leases in place at this property. Just 2. The building's been here, I think, since 2011, 2012, and there's 2 leases at the property. This is not a great location for office building. It's not metro. It's sort of in the middle between Potomac Yard and the real National Landing area. It's across the street from the bus depot and the sewage treatment plant. Not a very good location when you're trying to draw tenants in a market in which there's not a lot of tenants. The concessions happened in 2023. These are brand new concessions. The county guidelines state, quote, concessions are to be considered on a case-by-case basis, end quote. I think the assessment's revised number uses the actual in-place leases before concessions. However, again, they're not considering concessions. If this is not the case by case where concessions are considered, there's no case in the county in which concessions are considered. They have to be considered here, especially because they just happened. Given the recent nature of the deals, it seems like this is appropriate, or the county should be, or the assessment should be reflective of the concessions above the line. Again, we've discussed this in other cases, and we feel it's the similar situation here where the county or the assessment is just simply ignoring the concessions. You're not getting them above the line, we're not getting them below the line. They're sort of just ignored somewhere in the fray, and we feel it needs to be considered. Operating expenses, again, our study is not 10 properties. If you wouldn't mind, I'll share my screen with our expense study. These are the properties that we use in our expense study. As you see, a wide range. We removed, as it states down here, we removed 37 different properties from the properties we have because 23 of them had high vacancy. 11 of them were non-full service leases. They're leases that are, GSA leases where they pay their own utilities or they pay their own security, things like that are not comparable. These are the 24 properties that we use. The rates range. They range wildly. Therefore, we have an average of $11.03 per square foot, which we've, obviously simplified to $11 per square foot. We believe, again, this building is not stabilized. There's no history of expenses at this property. Therefore, we have to look to the competitive set. This is the competitive set in Arlington County. A wide range of properties ranging from a low of $8.12 a foot to a high of, I believe it was $17 per square foot or $16 per square foot. We obviously didn't use the high, didn't use the low. This is a new property. We need to look at the competitive set, and we believe that study shows what the range of expenses are appropriate. The county's expense number is an average of all I&Es received. Again, those are a lot of vacant buildings in there. It's not a number that's realistic to a building. If we're assessing a property as if it were, stabilized. You have to use a stabilized expense number, and the rate that's quoted in the guidelines is not that. Unless there's a study that was done by the county that we haven't seen yet, which we'd like to see if it was done. But that number that's quoted in the guidelines is an average of all the expenses, as far as we're understanding it, an average of all expenses. It's not an average, it's not a study of stabilized expenses, it's not a study of buildings that are leased. It's just all the expenses. So we believe that competitive set should be considered in selecting the appropriate expense rate for this property. Next point, capitalization rate. Again, I'm not going to rehash the same points that Jordan has been making. I know other appellants have been making. We believe the county has missed the mark. We believe the data shows that. We believe sales show that. We believe that the market continues to show that. Additionally, this property is massively vacant and has been its entire life. I used to live right down the street from here, and we drive by it every day, my wife and I, and we'd say there's the sewage treatment building still vacant. It's going to take a lot to lease this building up. There's very, very little leasing has happened in all the time that's been here. This vacancy impacts cap rate. It's been shown by sales. It's been shown by all the data that we've presented. There should be a distinction between a building that's 100% leased to GSA and a building that has significant vacancy issues. Which this property has. Fairfax County allows for an adjustment of 125 basis points for properties that are 40% vacant. This property is well above 40% vacant. Other jurisdictions adjust cap rates to reflect property-specific data. Again, this cap rate is the only data point that does not fluctuate at all, is not impacted at all by anything that happens in the property. And I believe it was mentioned in a board hearing last week where we had a GSA building. I think someone had mentioned that if GSA went and signed a 20-year lease tomorrow, the cap rate for the property would drop. If that's true, the counter to that has to also be true. Because GSA were in the building and it were to leave, the appropriate cap rate used to derive the value would have to increase immediately, because the cap rate is the lease. The tenant in the building is the most important part of the value. If you have a good tenant, your value is high. If you have a bad tenant, your value is low. It goes hand in hand, and that has to do with cap rate. It has to do with risk. And the deductions allowed for lease up do not capture that risk. It's an addition to the cost that are going to be incurred and stabilized in the building. The cap rate is extremely important. Again, we feel like the county or the assessment has not reflected the risk, and it's completely missing the mark. With that, we respectfully request the assessment to be reduced to $2,703,000. Any questions? We're happy to go deeper into our analysis. But thank you very much.
I thank you, Mr. Peralta, for the county, please.
Yes, thank you. For this property, this is actually a sister property to the one neighboring it. Mr. Balzotti didn't speak to that property. It is, I believe, 100% occupied. I believe Lytle, if I'm not mistaken, is the tenant occupying the space. That property in comparison is assessed at $34 a square feet. This property is at $32 a square feet with the deductions that the county affords based on guideline. So we reduce it again by 28%. So the $32 a square feet minus 28%, we're at $23 a square feet for this property compared to the sister property. With respect to again, this property is built in the same time frame as the sister property. When looking at this property, we did account for the square footage that is vacant in the property. We do see that the property did show a history of lower expenses. We did trend that upwards. I believe it's almost $1.40 than the last year's reported expenses. In 2023, they reported $8.83. Again, the county's higher at their expenses at $9 a square feet. The average, again, the average range that CoStar is reporting is $39.50 to $43.50. We're using $32 a square foot. And in our analysis, the INEs that we received we were at $40.50 per square foot for the submarket. Just speaking to Mr. Pozzati's, I guess, expense analysis, my numbers show there's about 51 properties that are, being assessed at 8% vacancy or lower, which would speak to some of the stabilization. If Mr. Balzati's 24, sample size is indicative of all 51 properties, then I think we come up with a slightly different number. I believe only 10 of the 51 is showing higher expenses relative to what they're speaking of at $11 a square feet. So chances are, I'm not speaking for Mr. Balzati, but maybe the 11 properties that I see are being used in his analysis for expenses, but that's not the case overall in the entire county. With the stabilized number that I see is closer to 51 properties. When you're looking at, I guess, the overall history of this property, we did see that there was some increases. Actually, we didn't include any of pass-through income or anything included in what you normally see in other properties that come before the board. We just use the office rents in place. You see that the Bright Horizons is in the building, and they're at a $45 per square foot rate. And the office building, again, is much lower than what we've seen in the market. And when you compare that to the actual sister property that is occupied, kind of speaks to how we view this property as, valuing it lower than that truly comparable property. I guess I'll just stop at this point. The way the review was presented to the county is they presented all three cases in one, and that's why you see that it may be a hard read, but our summary page kind of lists all three because that's the way it was presented. So I thought normally Jordan or Eileen would probably present all three cases at once, but we'll stop here at this point to kind of address the other cases at a later point. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions from board members? Mr. Yates.
Rob, you bring up the sister property. You happen to know what the expenses are at the sister property?
Yes, I listed it there at I think it was 760. Hold on one second. In my board memo notes.
Let's see.
They're at $9.
Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, Rob, was your, on the test, I can't read the number. Is that $9 for expenses?
Correct, on the test.
And on the sister building, have they got significant vacancy?
No, I believe they're fully occupied, and there was no review for this year.
Mr. Metzgen.
For the department, you have the cap rate as 7.34%. I've looked at the guidelines, page 28. So preliminarily, is this in the National Landing bid, or is this too far away? No, it's not Metro. Excessive.
Yeah, I think.
I can telescope it. I'm sorry. I don't see any number 7.34 on this entire page 28, especially for a fairly new building, effective year 2010. So where does it come from?
This is I believe 1990, I believe.
It's 2010, right?
2010, I'm sorry, 2010.
Eyeglass here.
2010.
All your cap rates, no matter where it is, what it is, how far it is way lower than that. But again, I don't see that number in the entire matrix.
I believe 7.34.
If I could posture, it's
If you can help, sure.
I believe it's a non-metro 7.3 rate with the Crystal City / National Landing bid tax added.
Correct.
So you get a 7.343 is really what it should.
Correct.
So you added the tax. Oh, everything I always thought was unloaded. In this case, it's not. Oh. So
Well, I think we took special consideration because I think the board and the appellant in previous years had made point that it doesn't conform to the rest of Crystal City National Landing, and I think we did take that in consideration.
well, meaning non-metro. It's
Correct.
much farther. Yeah, good. So, Mr. What number do you have plus the loaded tax comes out to 7.34? What's the base number in the matrix on page 7?
7.3 and then 0.043.
I don't see 7.3 in the national landing bid either.
It's non-metro 2010, far left corner at the bottom.
Non-metro 2010. I'm right. Yeah, 2320. I'm sorry. I don't want to belabor this. That's 6.8. 2010 to present, non-metro 6.8.
I think you're looking at previous year's cap rates.
I'm looking at 2023 office guidelines. Am I supposed to be looking at
2024?
Okay. Thank you. That's the answer. Sorry it took so long.
Any other? And Mr. Brault, if you take a minute to wrap up.
This needs to go. Okay.
Mary, I got a question for Rob.
I
real
was
quick.
always lagged.
All right, I'm sorry, Mr. Huff.
Sorry, I'm just trying to get the numbers straight in my head on the summary page, but I think I figured out what it is. I just want to confirm. Page 2 on the summary, somewhere in here it says the subject property is a 243,000 square foot office building. And then, we get to the matrix and it's 194, 444. And then it also says the total assessment for the 3 RPCs would be 48, 330, 500 or $200 per square foot. And when I add up the county's assessment, it's a little bit lower than that. It's like 46. I think that's because of the revision to one of them. There was a reduction or the proposed reduction. So I think I figured that out.
Yeah.
But I mean, maybe you could just tell me what size is the office building actually, and then what size is the retail component, and then how many parking spaces is the garage? Just like very simple metrics, because I'm not really clear on it.
Sure. I believe I made note that we didn't receive a rent roll. And so when we compare what was shown in, I guess, in CoStar, they're saying 221,686 square feet.
I see that. Yeah.
I think we opted to go with what was, I guess, shown in the past. In my most, I guess, in previous years' rent rolls. We didn't get that this year, I believe. I think I made note of that. And, usually we do. But in this case, I think it was not confirmed. I did make note of that. Yeah, it was not confirmed. So usually when I see rent rolls, I would see this is the suite number, this is what's vacant. And I didn't see that this year. So I made note of it as not confirmed. And I believe I asked the appellant or the agents for that information. So in essence, we're sort of going blind, and we're using, I believe, a higher per square foot vacant than the appellant is using in their pro forma. So I don't really know how to answer that, but
yeah. And then there's a Lidl owned condominium. So I want to make sure that's not also included in these square footages.
The what? I'm sorry.
Isn't one of these condos that the first RPC before this case is, 566 is owned by Lidl.
Yes, and that's the sister property that I was speaking to.
Okay,
that
yeah.
isn't assessed with this. Yes.
But that's not part of this office square footage.
No, it's not.
All right, Vincent, can you tell me how big the office building is under the RPC that ends in 567? And then how, like in terms of rentable square footage? And then how large the retail condo is?
Sure. We show the total NLA for the office at 197,059.
Okay.
And to Rob's point, he asked for the rent roll, and I think Jordan provided it back in July. So he should have that information. Not sure if it I think Deidre and Rob were both on the email, so I'm not sure what happened there. But the LA Fitness is shown as 45,966 square feet.
And that's not included in the 197 that you just gave me.
It's not. Those are two separate parcels. Yeah.
Okay, and then LA Fitness has an expiration coming up pretty soon, right? Because I've got a rent roll in my packet.
Yeah, the LA Fitness actually there's an amendment to that lease, so they amended that lease. I apologize for the confusion, but we have three separate cases, so I assumed that we were going by case. So the LA Fitness is something we discussed, yeah. But they did have an amendment. There's a bunch of concessions, and that's we can discuss that further at that time if that's appropriate. If that makes sense.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, Mr. Peralta, if you take a minute to wrap up.
Yes. Again, when comparing this to the most, comparable property, the sister property, we do see that in comparison, we are valuing this property less. We understand that the sister property is 100% occupied. We do kind of mirror, in essence, the expenses that are provided in the other property as well. It's fully leased. It's stabilized, and it's at $9 a square feet. Again, looking at the overall market, we do see that the rents are higher in the general market. Again, in comparison, that this property is at $32, $2 less than what is received at the other property. We ask that the board confirm this case, given that information. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Belzati, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Thank you. We believe the CoStar asking rents and market rents from other buildings at this property are not necessarily appropriate to use because we have two brand new leases at this property. The only leases at this property were entered into in 2023. They show what the true market rent is for this property. Those are the leases we need to consider when determining the market rent. The rent that is used by the assessment ignores the concessions. Again, the guidelines state that concessions will be considered on a case-by-case basis. If this isn't a case where concessions are considered, there is no case where concessions are considered. They need to be considered somewhere, and they're not considered. Cap rate, again, this building is massively vacant. The cap rates reflect is impacted by vacancy in the risk that's given to the property owner when they purchase a building that's massively vacant. It's take a long time to lease it up. Income stream is very risky. In regards to the sister property, it's a single tenant building. It's hard to say that it's truly comparable to a multi-tenant building that's 90% vacant. So while there are some things you can draw from that, I think cap rate and expense rates and rental rates are not something you can compare apples to apples with a building that has so much vacancy and has their own leases in place that show a market rent that's lower than the assessment uses. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, it's just among the board.
We reduced this quite a bit last year, didn't we?
Yeah.
We went. Let's see.
Under 10% reduction.
Yes. Yeah, so it's gone down a lot. It's very, very similar to where we ended up last year.
It was 26 million. We want to keep 20.
Yeah.
And nothing's changed. Well, it's interesting. The cap rate went up. So I compare it to the reporting for the office, but of course they don't report the value of the vacant office. And we got changing net leasable areas and changing this. I can't come out with anything cohesive because we're not giving anything cohesive, which leads me to the fact that the county is right unless proven wrong.
Yeah, we knocked it down from 31 to 26 and then from 26 to 24. And, I guess the question is, should we knock it down again or just leave it?
If you knocked it down, what would you use as a rationale?
I don't know. That's why.
Next time answers the question.
I know.
I mean, our job here isn't to just assume the county's wrong and over assessing. We've got to look at some.
And just for that cap rate issue,
Yeah.
that's where I was looking at the 2-year. And I recognize it adjusts every year, but I think the values are off on these very vacant buildings, and it's only getting worse.
I'm very.
500,000 square foot.
What is the vacancy on
200,000
this? I
square.
couldn't ferret it out anywhere. Is this 60% vacant or more?
87%.
Maybe this is another.
Yeah,
These are not
87%
going
vacant.
anywhere.
Maybe this is another exception for.
Mr. Mendez?
Yeah, sure. So what I did, because of, well, initially, the county is up about 1% year over year. So that to me didn't look right. So what I did, I just added 0.5% to the cap rate, and they came up with 22,225,500.
Based on the vacancy.
Based on the excess vacancy, yeah.
And I guess it's chronic vacancy. I mean, that's, we heard the appellant over and over again. It's doing,
2010.
It's not located in a good spot.
no, it's too far.
Yeah.
It's good for the hotel, but otherwise it's, or the McDonald's, but it's not so much.
And that's, using that number, I believe we're down 9% year over year, using that $22 million number. So that sounds.
Yeah.
So I'm okay with it.
I like,
Mr. Hoffman?
I
Are
think
you-
that's good. I think we should make a reduction here. This one's in rough shape. And you know, I had it 125 a square foot based on the county's assessment. I think it should be closer to 100, and Johnny's kind of got us halfway there.
Anything's better.
Okay. Mr. Mendez?
Sure. I would like to move and reduce the county's assessment to 222,225,500.
Wait a minute, say that again.
Based on the,
22 million. Say it again.
Oh, okay.
Hold on. Stop talking.
and that's based on the adding 0.5% to the cap rate based on the excess vacancy.
Motion is reduced to 222,225,500.
That's like 220 maybe?
22 million, not 200. That's what I was, that's what I was.
Did I say 200?
Yeah.
200.
I meant to say
Yeah.
22.
You might have stuttered.
22,225.
Yes.
Okay.
So that was-
22,225,500.
We'd be in court in the morning with that.
Do we have a second? Okay, Mr. Maskin, a second. All in favor? Opposed? Again? 6-1. Rhonda. Okay, the assessments reduced 22,225,500. Next case, 34027,568. Same address. Balzadi, statement of attendance.
Thank you. This is the LA Fitness portion of the property that we were just discussing. So there was an amendment to the lease. The new lease is at I think we provided that in our appeal. The county has revised the assessment here to 15,055,500. However, there are still 2 points of contention that we have with how the assessment has been derived. The first is the concessions, the failure to adequately consider concessions in this place. The second issue is the reimbursement income assumed to be received at the property. Regarding the concessions, the county's revised rental rate of $29.72 $29.72 per square foot fails to consider the concessions that were required by this lease and are also required by most leases, as we've discussed. Again, the county's guidelines state concessions are to be considered on a case-by-case basis. Yet they clearly were considered here because they're using the actual rental rate, the market rental rate or face rental rate of the new amendment at $29.72 per square foot. The lease required 9 months of free rent. none of which had been even given as of the date of value. It was still owed in the first 9 months of 2024. It's over $1 million of revenue that is going to be lost to the owner in the first 9 months of this year. It's not considered above the line. It's not considered below the line. Again, it's sort of ignored in the assessment. And I know it's been discussed in previous cases. And Mr. Peralta has said that they've given a concession or in the vacancy, but vacancy and concessions are two different things. Generally accepted appraisal practice requires you to do both. It requires you to consider concessions and it requires you to give a market vacancy. So the market vacancy that's been given should not be confused with concessions that it should also be given. And again, it's not here. It's not considered. This is a case, again, where the concessions are recent. They haven't even been paid yet. They're going to be paid in 2024. They need to be considered in the determination of the assessment. The assessment has not done so. Regarding the pass-through income, as we discussed in a prior case, the pass-through income from prior year is being used here. However, the lease was amended, basically extended at this point in time, and reimbursement income is not expected to be received in 2024, especially during the first 9 months when it is abated, specifically by the lease. So that reimbursement income, capitalizing that reimbursement income that doesn't exist, it results in a value that's not realistic. If you buy this building today or as of 1/1, you're not going to capitalize reimbursement income that did not exist. It simply wasn't there. So to do that is contrary to generally accepted appraisal practice, and it results in a property that's, an assessment that's in excess of fair market value. It just needs to be considered. I know that Mr. Peralta said that they've always used actuals, and that makes sense in which you have a building that's stabilized. If you have a stabilized offering, office building where they are throwing off reimbursements every single year, it makes sense to look to the history to project what's going forward. However, in a situation where the entire building has been renewed and those reimbursements are changing going forward, I think you have to consider the change and how it impacts the value, which we do not believe the assessment has done. So to sum up, we do not believe concessions have been adequately or at all considered at this property, which is sort of I think something's happening across all these properties we discussed today. And we believe the reimbursement income is overstated by the assessment. So with that, we respectfully request the assessment be reduced to $10,963,400 and are open to any questions you have. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Peralta for the county, please.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be brief as possible for this property. There's really not much there. When we look at other I guess retail, usually the rent is or the leases are triple net in nature. With this property, we see that the lease is actually at $35.70. In the rent roll that we see, Mr. Balzotti spoke to, our rental rate was much lower than that. I believe it's a 30% discount from what is shown here in our retest or our revision. And in addition to that, there's an 8% deduction from that value as well. So, I mean, that's not, typical. I guess that's actually, the 8% is, for if we're treating this as a separate entity, separate property, it's being valued at, 8% less than what it actually is. It's 100% occupied for this property. We're deducting expenses from that as well. And then in addition to that, we did see that, we tried to conform to what the renewal was for this space. So we gave a reduction and revised the assessment for this property to $15 million. So we do ask that the board confirm the reduction for this property. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from board members? Mr. Matzkin.
For the department, the appellant says you've made no accommodation for concessions. It's a real concession up front, one user, easy to figure out. My question to you is, in your original, what would be D2, you put in the rent for this space for almost 15 million, very close to 15 million. And in your test, in F2, it's down to just over, I said 15 million, I meant 1.5 million. In F2, it's just over 1.3 million. Is the difference concessions? If not, what is it?
Well, it's just that we're taking consideration what I guess the new lease was. But the rent roll shows that the contract rent is $35.70. We're using $29.72 in our revised.
Oh, that's the answer. Okay, because you don't give out the dollars per square foot in the F columns as you do in the D. That's the answer.
Yeah, I think I ran out of space, honestly, but I didn't want it to be even greater than it is.
0.2 font is small for me.
Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, this is for the owner. How long is this new lease or this amended lease? How long does it go into the future?
The amendment was for, let me just pull it up real quick. It runs through 2029, and the amended rental rate is $29.72 per square foot. It's not the $35 a square foot that Rob just mentioned. We included the lease abstract in our package, but it's runs through September of 2039 is the full extension, assuming that they don't opt out.
So it's a long term.
Correct.
Is your argument that under, I think it was this Charles E. Smith case, that the county has to consider the real lease rather than the average lease? And so that's your argument, basically, isn't it?
Correct. The actual lease in place is 2972, and that's before concessions. We have to consider the actual lease in place as of 1/1 and the concessions that were granted to get that lease, both of which, considering both of those things, you get to the rental rate that we assumed in our appeal of, I think it's 20.
But let me follow up. So
Sorry.
if we're going to look at the actual lease, there's no vacancy, correct? So the 8% that I'm looking at I guess you're page 4. So there shouldn't be a deduction for vacancy because there is no vacancy.
Well, the counter to that would be if the building was 100% vacant. We don't use 100% vacancy on a building 100% vacant. I think what you do is you're trying to stabilize it, and the appraisal, generally accepted appraisal practice also requires you to sort of stabilize expense or vacancy. So yes, actually, you're not going to get 8% vacancy here necessarily. However, the tenant also could always go under. You don't know what's going to happen in the future. So that builds in a little bit of protection for the unknown in the future, and which is why we're required, again, under general accepted appraisal practices, to include a market vacancy when valuing the properties. We don't go to actual vacancy, almost in any situation. So in this case, it also would not be appropriate to go to an actual vacancy number, we believe.
Yes, Mr. Brault, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Yes, thank you. Again, we do take into account the most recent lease. We do deduct another 8% from that. And so the net effective rent that we're assessing this property for is $27.34. We're also deducting expenses of, I believe, $9 a square feet. And we're coming up with value lower than our original assessment. So we did propose a reduction. Based on that, we asked that the board confirm the reduction for this case. Thank you.
And Mr. Balzati, if you take a minute to wrap up, please.
Thank you. Again, the assessment does not consider the concessions that have been granted, neither above the line or below the line. The new lease has 9 months of free rent that hasn't even been achieved yet. Anyone buying the building as of 1/1 would absolutely consider those in one way or another. The county guidelines require them to consider concessions on a case-by-case basis. I haven't seen it happen yet. Concessions and vacancy are two different things. Generally accepted appraisal practice requires us to consider both things, which we feel the assessment does not do. Reimbursement income that's being capitalized needs to be considered based on what's actually going to be received to the property. Using the most recent reimbursement income and capitalizing that, we do not believe reflects in a true market value of the property. Again, with that, we respectfully request that the assessment be further reduced from the county's original reduction to $10,963,400. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Bob. All right, let's just among board members.
I don't have a problem with the county's reduction.
Your best.
Good with it, the
Revised.
revised.
What about, I'll be the fly in the ointment yet once again. The county and the F column use the real lease amendment lease rate. And didn't allow for concessions, which were all this year as a part of that lease rate, and therefore didn't reduce it by the standard accustomed 10% of the lease rate. I didn't ask the county didn't counter this, so it must be true. Generally accepted appraisal practice says that you take a standard vacancy amount and you also account for concessions. They didn't counter that, so I'm assuming that's really true. And in this case, the county has taken the vacancy standard, but not the concessions, which is known, and again, upfront, not over time. It's not a mystery. We don't have a mix. We know exactly what it is. And I'm proposing that we reduce the income then by 8 months worth of rent for this long-term lease.
Isn't it typically spread out over life?
No, upfront saying,
That's
be
your
kind of way.
10%. That's what they usually do.
That's right, but it's not here. The county is using the lease rate in the amended the $29.
It's roughly that vacancy rate.
No, that's what they're paying, $29 plus a square foot, and then they're getting 8 months rent abatement upfront now. And this is all well known. And again, this is a single use. This isn't any blending. This isn't any average. I'm throwing it up for discussion if you just think I'm sleeping.
Not sticking.
Yeah, it would appear so. I think I'm right.
But it is,
But
Okay, hold on, Mr. Hoffman.
sorry.
I was gonna say, if you, I mean, do a little research on sales comps of LA fitness properties, and there's a range, obviously depending on the market and where it is, and the more desirable markets seem to be kind of below 7 still. So I look at the cap rate the county's using is probably reasonable, or maybe even a little high. So it's actually okay with the revised number.
Enough.
Yeah,
All
I'm okay with it.
right, somebody like to make a motion?
Sorry.
I'll go ahead and move that we reduce the assessment to 15,085,500. Effective revised numbers.
I'll second.
Motion is second by Mr. Mendez. All in favor? Aye, opposed? Okay, so it's 61 without Ken. The assessments reduced to the county's revised number of 15,055,500. Brings us to the final case on the agenda, which is AC 34027569. Address. Mr. Balzati, you can start with your 8 minutes on this property.
Thank you very much. This is our easiest of all the cases, so thankfully it won't last. This is the parking garage associated with the two buildings we just discussed. It's sort of a unique situation in the county with not a lot of standalone parking garages exist. The main point of argument here is we're looking at an income stream or an income to the parking garage that is sort of a short-term situation. The large percentage of the income received from the parking at this building was the result of sort of transient construction worker parking related to two local developments that were happening and are obviously going to finish at some point in time in the immediate future. The Lytle parking results in about $213,000 of parking income. The vast majority of the rest of it is resulting from these construction workers parking day to day. It's going to go away. It won't be here going forward. We believe it's inappropriate to capitalize income that is going to be gone in the short term. Doing that would be assuming that that income exists in the perpetuity, which we know it's not going to exist, and unless and until there's either future development, I guess. But if we're assuming income on a parking garage based on speculative future development, I think we're maybe sort of overreaching at that point in time. So again, very simply speaking, the actual income received is not reflective of the future income stream at the parking garage until and unless that building ever gets leased up. But given the last 12 years of leasing, it seems like it's going to be a long, arduous sort of process. So as the county has in other cases, the actual parking income should be used. However, we do believe that in this case, it's appropriate to make an adjustment to the actual parking income to reflect this sort of transient use of the parking garage by local construction workers, which will not exist, much longer. So with that, we request that the assessment for this garage be reduced to $4,510,600. And open to any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Peralta for the county, please.
Yes, thank you. I guess for the parking, we did find information relative to parking, and that was in our notes here that Lidl is increasing the amount of space that they will occupy. I believe it was in my notes 64 spaces that they will utilize, and so that's in essence going to guarantee the increase in the income. You'll see on page I believe it's page 34 of the packet. You'll see that that's page 13 of the appellant's supporting documents, that 64 spaces that Lidl employee parkers will occupy at an increase of $5,321 per month, an increase in daily revenue that we've seen, based on the budget that they provided on page 13 as well. So we did see comparably to other, when we compare this property to other garages in the county, we do see that this was being assessed at a lower rate. The county's guideline average that we utilize for the other properties is, I believe, the 12. I'm sorry, I have it here. 12. I want to say around $1,200 a square per space, and this property is being assessed at $950 per space. So therefore, we didn't test, given that the guideline is much higher than what we're actually testing or what we actually value this property to be. So with that, we ask that the board confirm this case, confirm the value. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Questions from board members? Mr. Lawson.
Yeah, on the this is for the applicant on the construction worker parkers, the parking. Is that individuals that are using the garage, or was that a deal that was worked out with whoever's constructing the building?
My understanding is it's the individual workers themselves are parking there. I'm not 100% confident in that, but I believe that's the case.
Okay, let me ask this question. I mean, basically, this is simply an income stream, and yet we have vacancy, and we're looking at it as if it's an income producing office building rather than just an income stream. Shouldn't we just take the income and give it a cap?
This is from the department.
Who are you asking?
I'm asking the applicant.
That is correct. However, in order to capitalize the income, it sort of has to be forward-looking, right? You're taking a income stream and capitalizing because you're assuming I'll be receiving this income over a term of X amount of years. So that would be correct. Again, if this were a stabilized sort of income stream, they do it. The assessments of other parking garages that are attached to or included with office buildings, the actual parking income is done all the time, and we don't necessarily just disagree with that in a stabilized situation. In this situation, because of this use of parking by the construction companies, it's not going to be received going forward. Therefore, capitalizing what will be received going forward, we believe is more appropriate.
Answer the question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other? Mr. Hoffman?
Yeah, is that the 7 point, to what Barnes was saying, is the 7.3 cap rate, is that based on general commercial guidelines or is that the office guidelines?
That is office.
But it's the same rate for general commercial in the guidelines, so it really doesn't matter, right?
I believe so. I can look for that if there's other questions.
Well, there's actually, sorry, it would be, I'm looking at the guidelines. You've got general commercial properties, PCC 211 and 212, which is retail, strip, commercial, and restaurant would be 7.3. Everything else would be 7.45. There's not really anything that's a parking garage, if you will, right? There's no category for that. So
I thought there was, but okay, maybe it does fall under general commercial properties. Yeah.
I'm just not sure which one to
7.3.
use if we were gonna consider this a general commercial condo. Because there's some lower rates for some medical commercial condos. There's a higher one for neighborhood centers.
I believe I conferred with Lori, and I believe the other parking garages had the same cap rate, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, so you're saying it's consistent across parking?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Peralta, if you take a minute to wrap up.
Yes. What we've seen with respect to parking income across the counties, there is an increase comparatively from last year, and that's why the guidelines did show an increase in the per space rate that we have. We had I believe about a $900 figure. I believe I kept this property the same, and I didn't increase it and kind of dismissed what the other properties were doing, given what the income for this property was achieving. And I do note that there's going to be an increase of about $63,000 just from the Lido spaces alone. So I ask that the board confirm this case. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Balzati, if you take a minute to wrap up.
Thank you very much. To the point that there's been an increase in parking across the county, that may be the case. However, I do not believe that anyone is coming to this specific area to look at the waste management center or the bus depot to draw more people to this area. There's no tenants in this building. They're having a hard time drawing tenants. The increase in income of $60,000 that the assessment or that Mr. Peralta had mentioned regarding the increase in Lidl doesn't offset the loss of the income that's going to be, happen as a result of the parking from the construction workers vacating at some point in time in the near future. Again, therefore, we believe that the correct methodology is to cap out the income that will be received going forward, which excludes that sort of transient income related to the construction workers. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you both. All right, it's just one word. Mr. Matz.
The wrap-up stimulated my neurons. The fact that Lidl is going to provide some revenue sometime this year in addition, and the contention that the construction workers are going to go away, and so going to be a reduction of revenue this year sometime. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. Just forget it. What I see is that on 1/1/23 versus 1/1/24, there's no change, and that's reflected within less than 1% in the evaluation. I can't imagine that we shouldn't support it as presented by the department.
And the
I agree.
value,
We've heard this argument before about the lease is going to be up. People are going to buy up.
Well, we hear it all the time.
Right, it's an ongoing.
next
thing.
year it's an
We
issue.
do assess it every year. Who knows? People could end up taking more of it. You don't know who's going to be in there, but cross that bridge when we get to it.
Sure.
I'm fine with it.
And it's just like the below the line deductions. Every year we'll figure it out.
Everybody else? Good?
Yeah, I actually came up with a higher value, so I'll go with
Well,
the
you
assessment.
paid the difference.
Oh, I think we should all buy this for $4,510,000.
All right.
I think the county should buy it. All those bus drivers at the bus depot walk down and park on the street right now. They're not providing them anything for the county's not. They pay that out of their own salaries. I think they should have a parking space in this garage.
Well said.
All right, there you go. Okay, I'm going to move to confirm the county. We have a second. Mr. Yates, all in favor? Aye, opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. County's confirmed at 6,374,100 even. That
Thank you.
completes the agenda. Balzati, I believe you get the award for putting the most words in your time.
I've been told I'm a fast talker. I was a middle child and I have two
Yeah,
small
thank-
children, so.
Thank goodness it was capturing what you were saying, because if I couldn't read it, I couldn't follow what you were saying. It was so fast.
Thank you, I
Second
appreciate
career
that.
on the radio commercial.
Thank you
He's
very much.
efficient.
Thank you.
Can't fault him.
Glad to finally meet you, Vincent.
Thank you, Rob, you too, appreciate it.
All
Thank
right.
you all for your
So
time.
we stand adjourned here at 10:56. Reconvene next Tuesday virtually for everyone. At 9 a.m. Thank you.
Okay. No,
Thank you all.
I think